He is losing. And the battlefield reality he faces is, I think, irreversible. In other words, President Zelensky and Ukraine have mobilized vastly better than has Russia. In other words, Ukraine has recruited, trained, equipped, organized, and employed forces incomparably better than Russia has. And the reality facing Russia now is that Ukraine, a country a third the size of Russia, has a bigger, much more effective army on the ground and other assets as well. All of this, of course, supported by the arsenal of democracy. The United States now up to $17 billion, over another billion announced this week, in military arms, ammunition, and materiel, and also supported by the other NATO countries and other Western countries around the world. So he faces a situation that I think, again, is irreversible. There's no amount of shambolic mobilization, which is the only way to describe it, no amount of annexation, no amount of even veiled nuclear threats can actually get him out of this particular situation. He announced the annexation, and he's already lost a really critical element in that, a critical city that would have been a very key supply hub had they been able to go farther. And that's just going to continue. He's going to continue to lose on the battlefield. And at some point, there's going to have to be recognition of that. At some point, there's going to have to be some kind of beginning of negotiations, as President Zelensky has said, will be the ultimate end. And at some point, by the way, as well, I strongly agree with the idea of Ukraine becoming part of NATO, although, as Senator Rubio noted, let's make sure that the battlefield goes well. There's nothing he can do at this point. Again, they have been many multiples in 7 months what Russia lost in nearly a decade in Afghanistan. Many, many multiples. And again, they're losing on the battlefield, and it's going to continue. The only question really is, when do you start to see not just individual soldiers or small units surrender, but when you start to see larger units crumble, crack, and perhaps actually collapse. And I think that will be coming. And then the questions for President Zelensky will be, do we retake that little part of the Donbass that was controlled by the separatists since 2014? And what about Crimea? And when do we have some kind of negotiation with Russia? And of course, by the way, in response to this annexation, Russia got hit by 100,000 more individual, personal, and other sanctions, showing that the West still has more that can be done to Russia. It can still get worse for Putin and for Russia. And even the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield won't change this at all. Jake Sullivan has publicly stated that the U.S. has communicated to Russia what would happen in response to that. We would respond by leading a NATO, a collective effort, that would take out every Russian conventional force that we can see and identify on the battlefield in Ukraine, and also in Crimea and every ship in the Black Sea. He's trying to cast this in any way that he can, in a way to appear threatening, to be threatening, to try to get Europe to crack. He thinks he can outsuffer Europe, if you will. You know, the Russians have outsuffered Napoleon and the Nazis and so forth, but I don't think he's going to outsuffer Europe. Europe's going to have a tough winter. There's going to be a very reduced flow of natural gas, but they'll get through it. And I don't think they'll crack on the issue of support for Ukraine.
Does Putin have to worry about opposition in
He does.
Russia?
This is why he didn't declare even the partial mobilization until just now. He was hesitant. And of course, now it's too late because he can't generate enough capable replacements and forces and units to plug the gaps. They're just going to continue to try to reestablish new defensive lines in the east. They're going to lose Kherson in the south, and eventually you're going to see some puncture in Donetsk and Zaporizhia in the center-south as well. So again, they're in a very, very difficult situation. Reportedly, more Russian men have left the country than have actually been conscripted or brought back. Basically, what you have is a president in Moscow who's watching his economy, his financial system, his inner circle, and his business community be seriously damaged, in some cases irreparably so. And then, of course, another president in Kyiv who's watching his country slowly be damaged, parts of it destroyed, terrible loss of innocent life as well as of his forces. Although the battlefield situation is a bit of a bloody stalemate, Ukrainians actually having halted the Russians around Kyiv, Kharkiv, and some others, and even pushing them back a bit in Kyiv. But then you have the situation in Mariupol, which has become a bit of a Ukrainian Alamo at this point in time. It's fighting to the last defender and pinning down multiple Russian battalions in so doing, very heroically. But ultimately, it looks as if it's going to have to collapse. It's going to be taken. And when it does, that is a moment of some peril for Ukraine, because now that port can be used by the Russians. Remember, they were using a port just to the west of that where a ship was hit and destroyed, Russian ship. They'll now have quite a good port on the Sea of Azov out to the Black Sea. And then it will free up a number of battalions that were the ones that have been closing the circle, closing the noose on Mariupol, who can then push further north and perhaps enable Russia to achieve what it has now said as it's redefined its objectives, to taking control of all of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, provinces, if you will, and then solidifying its grip on a land corridor from the Donbass, from those two oblasts all the way to Crimea. So this is going to be a very tenuous period the next few days as we see what happens in Mariupol, what the Russians are able to do as a result of it, and then how the Ukrainians can respond, because it's a very long distance from anywhere where they might have forces that they could possibly spare. And of course, in the meantime, very understandably, you have President Zelensky, who, despite hearing this extraordinary commitment from President Biden and from all the leaders of NATO at the summit this past week, nonetheless wants more. And I fully understand that. I mean, he's like a battlefield commander, and no commander has ever had enough forces, drones, Air Force, whatever it may be. And that's the position in which he finds himself, and we should understand that. And what we need to do is provide everything we can that can be provided without needlessly provoking a direct confrontation with Russia. I very much understand President Biden's concerns about that. Look, I think President Biden would be the first, knowing him, he'd be the first to say, oops, you know, okay, hey guys, okay, well, let's get on with it. And this should not overshadow what was an extraordinarily important and successful trip to Europe, one that the U.S. really led, as it has done so impressively, really, throughout this entire effort, and pulled together, guided, and then ultimately with this speech it was a very, very strong statement, obviously. This is going to set back his military for years. It's shown the whole world that it wasn't the wonderfully modernized force that, you know, everybody thought it might be. This has been a huge challenge for the Russians. You know, the fact that they've lost 7 generals just because they can't command and control sufficiently, they have to get out of their armored vehicles and go forward to find out why are they stopped again, this kind of thing. So I tend to think that his ambitions are going to be seriously set back by what takes place in Ukraine, noting that this is by no means nearing a conclusion.